What if I told you that the Black Death, as horrific as it was, might have been the key to unlocking the modern world? It's a chilling thought, but it's true. In our world, the plague wiped out over 30% of Europe's population. But in this video, we're erasing that event from history. We're about to see how this single change creates a domino effect that transforms everything from the fall of serfdom to the rise of democracy. Buckle up, because the world you're about to see might make you question everything you thought you knew about progress. A world bursting at the seams. Imagine you're at a party and it's so packed you can barely move. Now, picture that party lasting for centuries and you'll get a sense of what Europe was like in 1346. The continent had been on a wild population ride for about 300 years and things were getting pretty intense. Cities were bursting at the seams, with people crammed into spaces that would make a modern studio apartment look like a palace. In some places, entire families were living in areas no bigger than your bathroom. And let me tell you, that's not a recipe for happy neighbors or good hygiene. But it wasn't just the cities feeling the squeeze. Out in the countryside, farmers were getting creative and a little desperate. They were trying to grow crops on every scrap of land they could find. You'd see fields stretching up steep hillsides looking like they were defying gravity. These farmers weren't doing this for fun. They were trying to feed a population that just kept growing and growing. Now, you might think all this extra food production would mean people were eating well. But here's the thing. The average person's diet was actually getting worse. Meat was becoming a luxury, and more people were relying on grains to fill their bellies. It was like the whole continent was on an involuntary diet, and let me tell you, nobody was happy about it. And you know who else wasn't thrilled? The kings and nobles. They were starting to sweat, and it wasn't just because of their heavy robes. All these hungry people were making them nervous. You see, hungry people tend to get a bit cranky, and cranky people sometimes decide to overthrow their rulers. Not exactly the kind of party these nobles wanted to attend. But just when it seemed like Europe was about to burst like an overfilled balloon, something unexpected happened. It wasn't a plague or a war or a famine, the usual suspects for population control in those days. No, it was something much more mundane, but in its own way, revolutionary. A new type of plow was invented. Now, I know what you're thinking. A plow? Really? How exciting can that be? But hear me out. This wasn't just any plow. This new plow could turn over heavy soil much more easily than anything that came before. Suddenly, farmers could cultivate land that had been too difficult to work before. Fields that had been lying fallow for years were brought back into production, and just like that, the future started looking a whole lot brighter and tastier. This plow was like the agricultural equivalent of a superhero swooping in to save the day. Farmers could now produce more food with less back-breaking labor. And more food meant fewer hungry people, which in turn meant fewer headaches for those nervous nobles. But here's where things get really interesting. Remember all those people who, in our timeline, would have died in the Black Death? Well, in this alternate history, they're still alive. But they're not just sitting around twiddling their thumbs. They're changing history in ways no one could have predicted. The ripple effect of survival. Think about all those people who would have died in the Black Death. In our timeline, they vanished, leaving behind a world forever changed. But in this alternate history, they're still here, and they're about to turn Europe upside down. With more food available thanks to that nifty new plow, the population keeps growing instead of crashing. It's like someone hit the fast-forward button on European demographics. Cities are bursting at the seams, and the countryside is a patchwork of farms as far as the eye can see. But here's where things get really interesting. All these extra people aren't just taking up space, they're changing the very fabric of history. You see, some of these folks were never meant to exist in the first place. Take, for example, a boy born in England in 1360. In our timeline, his grandparents would have succumbed to the plague. But here, he grows up to become one of the most brilliant military commanders Europe has ever seen. He's like a medieval Napoleon, minus the height complex and the hand-in-waistcoat pose. Meanwhile, across the channel in France, a girl is born in 1375 who, by all rights, shouldn't exist. Her parents should have died before they even met. But in this plague-free world, she grows up to become a renowned artist. Think Leonardo da Vinci meets Frida Kahlo, but with a distinctly 14th century flair. Her paintings challenge the very foundations of medieval art, pushing boundaries that weren't supposed to be pushed for another century or two. But it's not just individuals making waves. These extra people are inventing things and having ideas that are rewriting the course of history. Remember how the Black Death led to some major technological advancements? Well, without that push, Europe might have lagged behind in these areas. But our alternate Europe isn't sitting still. Instead of necessity being the mother of invention, it's sheer numbers and competition driving innovation. You've got inventors popping up left and right, creating machines to make farming more efficient, to help with the booming textile industry, even to improve sanitation in those overcrowded cities. It's like the Renaissance decided to show up early to the party, bringing all its friends along for the ride. Now, you might think more people means more progress, right? Well, yes and no. See, this alternate Europe is a bit like a historical funhouse mirror. Some things you'd expect to see are missing, while others are blown way out of proportion. Take wars, for instance. Some conflicts that shaped our history never happened in this timeline. Why? Because the leaders who would have started them were never born. That war that was supposed to reshape the borders of Eastern Europe, poof, gone. The rebellion that would have toppled the dynasty never happened. But don't think this means Europe is all peace and harmony. Oh no. Remember all those extra mouths to feed? Well, even with improved farming techniques, resources are starting to feel scarce again. And you know what happens when people start fighting over resources? That's right, brand new conflicts are breaking out. You've got wars erupting over things like prime farmland, water rights, and trade routes. Conflicts that never happened in our timeline are now shaping the fate of nations. It's like history decided to play a game of what if, and things are getting wild. As a result, the map of Europe is starting to look very different from the one we know. Countries that should have united stay divided, while others form alliances that never existed in our timeline. Imagine a Europe where France and England are best buddies, while Germany is a patchwork of tiny states constantly at each other's throats. Or picture a powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that stretches from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The ripple effects of all these changes are enormous. Trade routes are shifting, new cultural centers are emerging, and the balance of power is in constant flux. It's like someone took the Europe we know, shook it up like a snow globe, and set it back down again. A different Renaissance. As we leave behind a Europe reshaped by wars and alliances, let's turn our attention to the realm of art and ideas. You'd think more people would mean more creativity, right? Well, hold on to your berets, because the story of culture in this alternate world is about to take some wild turns. Remember the Medici family? In our timeline, they were the big shots of Florence, throwing money at artists like it was going out of style. But in this world without the Black Death, they're just another group of moderately successful merchants. You see, without the plague wiping out a huge chunk of the population, there wasn't that sudden concentration of wealth among survivors. No Medici patrons means no Botticelli's Birth of Venus hanging in the Uffizi. Can you imagine a world without that iconic painting? But it's not just the Medicis. The whole patronage system that supported Renaissance artists and thinkers never really takes off. And that brings us to everyone's favorite Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci. In our world, he was painting the Mona Lisa and sketching flying machines. But in this timeline, he's still a brilliant guy, but without wealthy patrons to support his artistic endeavors, he becomes a successful engineer instead. Imagine Leonardo designing bridges and war machines, but never picking up a paintbrush. It's like someone took the Renaissance and put it through a funhouse mirror. Now, you might be thinking, surely all these extra people would lead to more art and culture, right? Well, yes and no. See, the thing is, the Renaissance as we know it doesn't happen. At least, not in the same way. Without the societal upheaval caused by the Black Death, there isn't that same shift in focus towards humanism and the arts. It's not that culture doesn't develop, it's just different. Take the printing press, for example. In this timeline, it's actually invented earlier. More people means more demand for books after all. But here's the kicker, it's spreading different ideas than in our timeline. Instead of printing Dante's Divine Comedy, maybe we're seeing more practical manuals on farming techniques or guides to urban planning. The bestsellers lists of this alternate 15th century would look pretty weird to us. And let's talk about universities for a second. In our timeline, the Black Death led to a shortage of educated people, which actually opened up opportunities for social mobility. But in this world, universities are packed to the rafters. We're talking fierce competition for sports and new ways of thinking born out of necessity. Imagine Oxford or the Sorbonne with class sizes triple what we're used to. It's like the worst group project you've ever been part of, but on a massive scale. This overcrowding leads to some interesting developments in science and technology. In some areas, we're seeing advances that would make our heads spin. Maybe they've got steam engines a century early, or they've cracked the secret of refrigeration. But in other areas, things are actually lagging behind. Without the labour shortages caused by the Black Death, there's less incentive to develop labour-saving devices. So while they might have fancy mechanical clocks, they're still ploughing fields by hand. By the time we hit the 16th century, this alternate world looks both familiar and alien. It's like someone took our history books, put them in a blender, and tried to piece them back together. There are amazing inventions we've never seen, but also gaps in knowledge we take for granted. Maybe they've got flying machines, but they haven't figured out how to properly preserve food. Or they've got advanced mathematics, but their medical knowledge is still stuck in the Middle Ages. Conclusion. So, what have we learned from our journey through a world without the Black Death? Well, for starters, history isn't just a series of events happening one after the other. It's more like a giant game of dominoes where one small change can send everything tumbling in a completely different direction. Take the Protestant Reformation, for example. In our timeline, the questioning of religious authority that led to this massive shift was partly influenced by the societal changes brought about by the Black Death. But in our plague-free world, that spark of rebellion might never have ignited. You see, history is full of these what-if moments. It's not just about the big battles and famous figures we read about in textbooks. It's about the countless small decisions and chance events that shape our world in ways we can't even imagine. So next time you hear about a historical event, try asking yourself, what if it never happened? You might be surprised at how different our world could have been. Stay tuned.